During the Second World War, many terrifying events took place. In Europe, the Axis powers, led by the Nazi regime, perpetrated many atrocities against humanity. Their counterpart in the Pacific theater, Imperial Japan, was equally brutal. Some experts believed that the Japanese under Emperor Hirohito's rule were even worse than Hitler's Nazis. Toshio Tono, a Japanese medical doctor, spoke to The Guardian in 2015 about the horrific nightmare he witnessed that made him feel ashamed of wearing the prestigious medical white coat. Tono's aspiration was to become a gynecologist. However, when he was a first-year student at Kyushu Imperial University's medical school in southern Japan, Tono became an unwilling witness to horrific crimes. He recalled that when a US B-29 plane crashed on the island of Kyushu, the remaining American airmen who survived were captured and brought to their school. They were blindfolded and wounded. Toshio Tono, a Japanese medical doctor, told The Guardian in 2015 about the horrifying nightmare he experienced that made him feel disgraced of wearing the esteemed medical white coat. Tono's ambition was to become a gynecologist. However, when he was a first-year student at Kyushu Imperial University's medical school in southern Japan, Tono became an unwilling witness to horrific atrocities. He remembered that when a US B-29 plane crashed on the island of Kyushu, the remaining American airmen who survived were captured and brought to their school. They were blindfolded and wounded. These Allied soldiers became subjects for a series of gruesome experiments. Some organs were removed from their body, while others were injected with seawater to see if it worked as a substitute for sterile saline solution. In another experiment, doctors drilled through the skull of a live prisoner, apparently to determine if removing some part of the brain could treat epilepsy. The experiments had absolutely no medical merit. They were being used to inflict as cruel a death as possible on the prisoners. I was in a state of panic, but I couldn't say anything to the other doctors. We kept being reminded of the misery US bombing raids had caused in Japan. But looking back, it was a terrible thing to have happened. Toshio Tono. However, Tono's stories about medical experimentation against the Allied soldiers were not the worst of it all. As he claimed, Japanese officers ordered that some organs be removed from the victims' bodies to be cooked and served. And the soldiers then had a feast. Tono's allegation of Japanese soldiers cannibalizing in Kyushu was not the only account of such terrible act committed by imperial forces. Cannibalism did occur in the Pacific theater, according to testimony from various parts of Asia. And the victims included not just captives but also innocent people. Incidents of cannibalism performed by Japanese soldiers were also reported in the isolated province of Bukidnon in the southern Philippines. According to Rolando Esteban's research paper, he investigated why Japanese soldiers became cannibals in this region during the war. 10 hours after bombing Pearl Harbor, the Japanese controlled the Philippine archipelago. The country was a commonwealth of the United States at the time. The Japanese overcame the combined troops of Filipinos and Americans, leading to the country's 4-year subjugation to the Japanese. Esteban mentioned Yamamoto, a witness of Japanese cannibalism in the Philippines. Yet not against POWs or civilians, but rather among imperial soldiers. A former lieutenant, Yamamoto, inadvertently killed Philippine citizens under his command, hacked off the limb of a dead comrade with a sword, and witnessed cannibalism among Japanese troops. Esteban also looked at Radio Tanaka's 1996 book, The Secret Horrors, Japanese War Crime in World War II. The book recorded the crimes committed by Japanese soldiers in the Philippines, including rape, murder, prostitution, the Death March, and cannibalism. Tanaka stated that starvation forced Japanese soldiers to devour the flesh of their colleagues, adversaries, and civilians during the war. Cannibalism had already been part of these soldiers' training before they were dispatched on the battlefield. The Imperial Army Command had prepared the soldiers for the possibility of cannibalism. Part of the brainwashing of soldiers prior to deployment to the front lines included convincing them that their enemy were pigs. Prisoners from the United States and Australia were labeled as white pigs, while Indians and Pakistanis were labeled as black pigs. Tanaka. The Japanese 18th Army was stranded in New Guinea in 1944 after the Allies defeated their counteroffensive in the Battle of the Driniamore River. After these soldiers assumed the war was finished, the Aussies took over and cleared out the remaining Japanese. After Allied troops destroyed their naval supply lines, the Japanese forces were seriously reduced. They were reduced from 20,000 troops to roughly 1,000. These men later surrendered to the Allies, which was viewed as a huge humiliation in Japanese culture. The Imperial men followed the Bushido warrior code, which stipulates that for Emperor Hirohito, one must die rather than surrender. But those soldiers who were subjected to harsh conditions in New Guinea chose to break their code in order to survive. They, too, engaged in cannibalism while hiding. And when they surrendered to the Australian soldiers, they were more healthier and more orderly, contrary to conventional opinion about how people in distress should appear. The captured Japanese soldiers were accused by the locals of eating a peasant. The Australian forces investigated and interrogated them. These Japanese admitted to cannibalism. However, the soldier in charge of the macabre meal died at the time. As a result, the Allies halted the probe. According to records uncovered in Australia and revealed by the Kyoto News Service in 1992, starving Japanese soldiers not only ate the flesh of POWs and slave workers during World War II, but they also stripped the meat off live individuals. The records were described by Kyoto as the first official proof that former Imperial Japanese Army personnel engaged in cannibalism. One American president escaped the Japanese's vengeance via sheer luck. He was none other than George H.W. Bush, Republican Texas, father of George W. Bush, Republican Texas. According to James Bradley's book, Flyboys, the 20-year-old Bush served as a U.S. Navy pilot during World War II. During bombing passes over the little island of Shikijima, their jet was shot down by the enemy. The 9 aviators attempted to avoid capture by the Japanese. Yet just one of them escaped, and that was Bush. Surgeons excised a 6-pound portion of thigh measuring 4 inches by 12 inches. It was made with soy sauce and vegetables, then washed down with hot sake, according to Japanese survivors on the island. 2018 Insider. After bailing out of his plane, Bush was washed further away from the island. Several pilots attempted to protect Bush while he was in the water. They were on the lookout in case the enemy's boats came close to him. After 4 hours of waiting and floating, Bush was rescued by the USS Finback, a submarine that surfaced right in front of him. In 1945, the Australian Army rescued an Indian soldier at Sepik Bay. One of the Japanese POWs was Jemadar Abdul Latif. Latif sued the Japanese for cannibalism, claiming that the soldiers ate locals as well as Indian POWs in New Guinea. A Japanese medical official visited the Indian compound at Swade on a regular basis, selecting the healthiest soldiers each time. These men were abducted and never returned. 1946, The Times of London. Sworn statements presented to the Allies War Crimes Investigative Commission backed up and bolstered Latif's charges. On August 25, 1945, Captain R.U. Purzai and Subedar Dr. Gurcharan Singh told the Australian Courier Mail, "Just 50 of the 300 guys that went to WWII with me returned. 19 people were eaten." Lieutenant Tomasa, a Jap medic, would create a party of 3 or 4 men and send an Indian outside the camp for something. The Japs would quickly slaughter him and consume his flesh. The liver, buttocks, thighs, legs, and arms muscles would be hacked off and roasted. According to Reuters, on April 2, 1946, a Japanese commander was found guilty on 14 charges of cannibalism and sentenced to death. According to Rebel, Japanese Lieutenant Izata Tomiyasu has been sentenced to death by hanging for the 1944 murder of 14 Indian soldiers and cannibalism at Wewak, New Guinea. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and press the bell icon to get new video updates.